Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be right back into the terrestrial scanning and survey project we started looking at 2 weeks ago. If you haven't watched the first two episodes yet, I'd recommend pausing this and watching those first. In episode 1, we introduced the job and went over some of the tactics we'll be using when we establish the survey control network, and in episode 2, we covered the equipment we used and how to calibrate it. This week, we are finally collecting the survey and scan data and running through some of the survey data processing. We just finished our site walk, demarcated our control points, and calibrated our equipment. It's Sunday evening, and my coworker Josh White and I have about 2 hours left of daylight to work with and a few thousand feet to traverse to encircle our building with traverse hubs and common points. We started the traverse setting up our instrument on an assumed coordinate values of 5,000 feet north, 10,000 feet east, and 100 feet of elevation at the northwest corner of the site over a scribed cross in the sidewalk, which we assigned the point number of 102. We then backsighted the concrete nail we set on the northeast corner of the site and assumed an approximate azimuth of 90 degrees to and numbered it 101. Since this project did not require any georeferencing, we did not need to tie in any of our traverse hubs with GNSS, and we worked in a ground-based system with a scale factor of 1.0. As of right now, our data is essentially floating in space and approximately referenced to north. I will end up tweaking this orientation later to rotate the control network and therefore the scan data that it will be connected to, so that the walls of the building are oriented more or less in a north, south, east, west orientation. This will make it easier to work with the 3D scan data as the building will be orthogonal to the cardinal directions. Had it required georeferencing, we would have set up a base station on one of the traverse hubs, first using an autonomously derived coordinate value, or a here position as Trimble calls it, and started collecting static data. I would then use a rover to measure several of the other traverse hubs in the network using RTK. This would have got us enough data to georeference the control network plus or minus about 3 meters or so, but should have given us pretty good orientation to grid north once all the RTK observations were brought into StarNet and combined with the total station measurements in a least squares adjustment. When we use a least squares adjustment, we aren't limited to defining our orientation by holding the azimuth between only 2 points. We can use as many RTK measurements as we would like. This can be advantageous when we're striving for a higher level of absolute accuracy, as we can spread out the error in the orientation from the RTK measurements over several points. It's always a good idea to take at least 2 sets of RTK observations separated by at least 4 hours to allow the satellite geometry and atmospheric conditions to significantly change between measurement epochs. If possible and time permits, it doesn't hurt to repeat this measurement scheme on a separate day as well. I also like to use GNSSplanning.com to verify there shouldn't be any issues with using GNSS during the planned time of data capture. To tighten up that plus or minus 3 meter absolute autonomous position, we need to download the static data off the base receiver and post-process it using Opus, for example, to turn that autonomous position of the base station that is accurate to a couple meters to a differential post-processed position that is much more accurate in the range of a few centimeters or a tenth of a foot or better, depending on the duration of observation, satellite geometry during acquisition, and a few other factors. If there was a published control monument or two nearby, it certainly wouldn't hurt to check into those with the rover as well. And if I had access to a local RTK correction service, I would have measured the base point in using that before setting up the base receiver instead of using an autonomous position. Redundancy with GNSS never hurts, and the more checks you have, the easier troubleshooting will be if issues arise later. Due to the nature of the deliverable and what the data was going to be used for, if I was georeferencing this project, I would not have registered the point cloud using the grid coordinate values of the control points. I would have converted the georeferenced grid coordinates to a ground-based coordinate system, as the client doesn't want to know the dimensions of the walls in grid feet. They need to know the true ground-based dimensions. I do have a video on grid versus ground coordinates if there's any confusion about what I meant there. Once we were set up and running through the traverse, there really wasn't anything special about how we performed that part of the survey beyond everything I covered in the previous 2 episodes. I set up on 100, set a mini tribrac on 101, our backsite common point 102, and another mini tribrac on our foresight common point 103, and had to use our full-size GLS 13 rod on our foresight traverse hub 104 because the sight line to the ground was impeded. I ran rounds on all 4 traverse hubs and common points, checked for any outliers in the rounds, and when we were satisfied, we ended that station setup and moved the instrument from 100 to 104, moved the mini that was on 102 to the new foresight common point 106, moved the mini that was on 101 to the new foresight point 105, and brought the full-size prism over to 100 for our new backsite. We continued this same methodology until our final setup on 101, the initial backsite, where we closed out to our original setup point 100 and the original backsite common point of 102. By this time, the sun had set. We were both pretty hungry as we hadn't had a proper meal in about 12 hours, so we packed up and headed back to the hotel to process our raw data and see how the traverse closed after adjustment. Of course, we checked and booked our closing shots in the field to make sure there were no blunders, but those values were from an unadjusted traverse. Once StarNet adjusts the data with a least squares adjustment with all the common points to tighten up the traverse, we get to really see what kind of closure we're looking at. It's now about 8:30 p.m. on Sunday evening. We made it to our hotel and it's time to fire up StarNet. When I processed the raw observation data to utilize the common points of the traverse for the first 3 legs, but separated out the 2 closing shots to our initial setup point of 100 and our initial backsite common point of 102 and the traverse hub they were shot in from, we had delta values to 100 of 6 thousandths of a foot or 2 millimeters horizontally, and 8 thousandths of a foot or 3 millimeters vertically, and 3 thousandths of a foot or 1 millimeter horizontally to 102, and 2 thousandths of a foot or 1 millimeter vertically. This gave us a closure ratio of about 1 to 320,000 to 0.100. So far, we're looking pretty good. I closed the traverse in StarNet and checked our error propagation values. These were hovering around 5 thousandths of a foot to 9 thousandths of a foot, or 2 to 3 millimeters in the semi-major axis of the 95% confidence area ellipse horizontally, and about 3 to 4 thousandths or 1 millimeter vertically. Remember, these calculated values are at 95% confidence, and we're aiming for 3 millimeters at 68% confidence. So to convert our goal of 3 millimeters at 68% confidence, we can double that 3 millimeter value of allowable standard deviation to 6 millimeters at 95% confidence. We are now at about half of our allowable expected error currently, and we have a lot more observations we're going to be adding in tomorrow, which should tighten up our control network even further. StarNet also calculates and displays residuals for every single distance and angle measurement we made, so I can check for any outliers and remove them if necessary. This is extremely handy and one of my favorite features of doing a least squares adjustment. It's pretty easy for a bad observation to sneak by in the field, but with StarNet I can quickly yet meticulously go through every single observation and see if there are any that are causing issues. I often get the question, is it really necessary to post-process your survey data using a least squares adjustment? Can't we just use the exported CSV directly from the data collector? You can, and sometimes it's acceptable to do so, but once you get the hang of using a least squares adjustment software, it really doesn't add much time, and I could go on for the next 30 minutes about the advantages of doing so. I already have a bunch of videos on that, so check out my StarNet playlist if you're interested in this topic. But this dataset took me maybe 15 minutes from start to finish to run through, QC, and export a new set of coordinates. To me, that's just a no-brainer. I'm going into the field tomorrow knowing my control network is tight, and I can pass the data off to Josh knowing he shouldn't have any issues using it. It's now about 8:45 p.m., which leaves me enough time to import the newly adjusted coordinates into the data collector, charge up all of my batteries, and finally have some dinner before heading to bed and getting some sleep for the big day we have planned tomorrow. We arrived on site at 7 a.m. Monday morning. The first task was to meet with the client and make sure we were all on the same page about exactly what he was looking for. After a quick introduction, we got right to work. Before I start scanning, we have to start placing our black and white vinyl targets that we use to QC the point cloud later. On a site this size, we typically place anywhere from 15 to 20 of these targets evenly distributed across the site that we can measure in with the total station. Those targets are then captured in the point cloud while scanning the building, and since our point cloud is registered to the survey control network that it includes the QC targets, we can extract coordinate values of the center of the target from the point cloud and compare those to the coordinates of the targets as defined by the survey control network. This gives me an idea of what kind of error was introduced from the point cloud registration process that we will look at in the next episode. We buy these half-page vinyl targets as blank 8.5 by 11 vinyl sheets from Uline and then just print a target template that was made in Excel on the blank sheets. These vinyl targets last way longer than the paper version, so if you're going to take the same route, I highly recommend paying the 50 cents per target and switch to vinyl stickers instead. We've tried both and it can be a real pain removing the paper targets, and if they're set outside and it rains, they don't last very long. The ink runs and they start to deteriorate rather quickly. I've had these vinyl targets up at my house now for a couple months and they still look as good as the day I set them. One thing to watch out for is when I first used these vinyl printer sheets, I would get smudging during the printing process if I used the stock printer settings. If you do as well, try switching the printer settings to using glossy paper and it should hopefully fix that issue. I believe a laser printer is required as well. Josh worked ahead of me, setting the black and white targets in locations he could see from either the main traverse hubs or the common points. Keep in mind, you always want to keep your total station observations as perpendicular to the line of sight as possible when taking reflectorless measurements. Reflectorless measurements lose accuracy surprisingly fast as the angle of incidence increases. This is where using the Rothbucher systems of prisms and targets really comes in handy. Since you swap the nodal prisms out with the target paddles, this is a non-issue. Unfortunately for us, we just didn't have the extra room in our luggage and they take a bit more time to set up in the field, and since we were rushed on this one, we decided to make do with these stickers instead. If we were using the RTC that actually uses the black and white targets for registration and not just targets as QC checks, I probably would have spent the extra bit of time and energy to use the Rothbucher system. The Regal VZ600i instead scans in control using retro reflective targets that I set up over the traverse hubs as I scan my way around the building. As soon as Josh had a few black and white targets up, I was able to fire up the scanner and get to work. I decided to run 2 concentric circles around the building at different distances. I did this to add some variation to the scan angles and hopefully reduce scan shadowing as much as possible, while increasing the geometry between individual scans of the scan network. This wasn't absolutely needed, but I knew how long one lap around the building would take me, and I knew I had enough time to do another. Due to the shape and height of the building, there were sections of walls that needed to be scanned that were relatively far away from what could be scanned from the ground. This meant there were going to be areas with less than optimal overlap, and as such, the cloud-to-cloud registration would probably need some help in those areas. So what I did to give the cloud-to-cloud registration as much help as I could was take a bunch of extra high-density overlapping scans to these areas from the ground and from the roof back down to the ground. This would mean that even though the scan positions we needed to link to each other were relatively far away, there would still be dense data surrounding those new scan positions they could use for the cloud-to-cloud registration. This was the issue I brought up in the first episode where I knew I was going to have to climb up on various rooftops to add in new scan positions that were further away from the ground scans than I would have liked. Adding in extra control points on these rooftops would have helped as well. The issue there was that these rooftops were fairly spongy and had a lot of flex in them. I was worried about the quality of the verticality of the control points set on these roofs. A workaround for this would have been using wall-mounted retro reflective targets, which unfortunately we didn't have available to us at the time, but after this job I picked up some Rothbucher retro reflective targets that would have been perfect in this situation. Once I was up and running with the scanner, it's really pretty simple to capture data. You basically set the scanner and tripod down approximately level where you want to start scanning, press one button, and about 45 seconds later it's finished. Then you pick it up, move it where you want to take the next scan, and press the same button. Rinse and repeat. Regal recommends not spacing scans out by more than 10 to 15 meters or 30 to 45 feet outside. But that distance should really be dictated by overlap and scan shadows. You don't want to jump ahead 45 feet if you're moving the scanner around a corner or through a doorway, for example, as you'll lose a lot of that overlap you'll need later during registration. But if you're out in the open with good geometry the scanner can pick up and use for cloud-to-cloud registration like walls and other flat surfaces, and moving 45 feet will still retain good overlap, you should be fine. I try to picture where the points captured from each scan overlap with the points captured from neighboring scans to make sure I have the right amount of scan-to-scan overlap. I'm generally trying to maintain at the very least 20% overlap between scan positions, ideally much more than that. You also don't want to jump scan positions too far ahead and create scan shadows in areas you need to extract data from later. It's fairly easy to imagine where all the points of a single scan are going to land. This is line of sight technology. If you stand where the scanner is set up and you can see something, there's a good chance the scanner will pick it up as long as it's not too far away. So for example, if there's a dumpster or other obstruction blocking the corner of a building you want to map from a particular scan position, you'll need to leapfrog the scanner in a manner that it will fill in that missing data as you make your way along. There's always going to be shadows behind objects from a single scan position, but as you start adding additional scan positions in, each new scan will start filling in these shadows, and as these additional scans get added in, the scan shadows are iteratively reduced. There will always be some scan shadows left, but it's the operator's job to minimize the shadowing in areas that are especially important. Laser scanning is a bit of a balancing act between time spent acquiring the data and the completeness of that data set. Visualizing this becomes easier and easier with experience, and if your field crews aren't processing or using the final point cloud data themselves, it's a great idea to sit down with them and go over that final point cloud so they can start to see how their field data capture techniques affect shadowing. I spent the next 10 hours making my way around and on top of the building, bumping the retroreflective target from traverse hub to traverse hub and scanning the exterior of the building as complete and free of shadowing as was possible with the time I had available to me. All the while, Josh was placing and tying in black and white QC targets ahead of me and setting extra traverse hubs I could use as scan control points where needed. Josh and I both finished up our respective tasks for the day right as the sun was starting to set. We packed up our gear and headed back to the hotel to grab some dinner and process the day's survey data in StarNet and download the scan data from the scanner. When Josh was working today to establish coordinates for the black and white targets, he didn't only set up, backsite, and tie in the targets. He also took the opportunity while set up on the common points or new traverse hubs he set for scan control to take extra observations on the other traverse hubs to increase the amount of traverse cross ties. Since we've worked together for quite some time on very similar projects, he has a very good idea of how long scanning will take me and can plan his survey out so he isn't done 3 hours before me and just sitting around and watching me scan. Remember, extra redundant total station observations mean reduced random error. I've said it 100 times before. Survey accuracy is a balance of time and accuracy, and he knew he had extra time available to him, so he used that to tighten up his survey control network accuracy with extra observations. Those extra observations from the total station really helped to tighten up the survey control network in StarNet, with standard deviations of our control hovering around 2 to 3 thousandths of a foot or 1 millimeter in each axis. However, the standard deviations on our QC targets were about 2 to 3 times worse than our traverse hubs and common points. This was because, like I mentioned previously, the QC targets were only measured from a single control point, but since the traverse hubs the QC targets were tied in from had great coordinate quality, all the QC target coordinates still met spec. Earlier in the video, I mentioned I wanted to rotate our control network in a manner that the building would run north, south, east, west. To accomplish this in StarNet, I inversed between two black and white targets on either end of an east-west running wall and noted the azimuth between them, calculated its deviation from 90, and subtracted that angular deviation from the initial backsite azimuth we set of 90. Now when I'm creating sections in nForce later, I don't need to create a user-defined coordinate system, and it just makes life easier for everyone working with the point cloud data. With every control network I do, I make what I call an accuracy report. I use an Excel template that I created where I fill out the job number, the horizontal coordinate system, the vertical datum used, and if the points are in a scaled ground coordinate system based off a known mapping projection, I'll call out the scale point and combined scale factor used so someone can easily convert the coordinates back into grid if needed. I note what kind of observations were made, the chi-squared values from the adjustment, and most importantly, the adjusted coordinates and their associated standard deviations. The template is set up so I simply paste the coordinate values into a hidden page, and the template will automatically separate my QC shots and scan control and place them in their correct locations based on how I code my points. I use this same Excel spreadsheet to house my point cloud and deliverable quality control, which will populate in episode 4. Once everything is filled out, the template will make a PDF report that gets delivered to the client. Sometimes a savvy client will specifically request a full report if they understand error propagation or want the metadata of the control network, in which case I'll just send them the whole spreadsheet. For now, I can drop my adjusted coordinates and their coordinate standard deviations into the accuracy report and fill out the front page, but to finish it off, I'll need to register the point cloud, extract the deliverables, and run through the QC process. That wraps up the survey portion of this project. Now it's time to deal with the 160 gigabytes of raw scan data that was captured. My first priority is to back up the data, then import it into RiScan, Regal's point cloud processing software, to start the registration process. The issue with this is when we're talking about datasets that start getting into the hundreds of gigabytes, they can be difficult to deal with because of their file size. The raw data can be transferred off the scanner's portable hard drive to my laptop fairly quickly. Normally, I would then back up the data to the cloud and download it from there on my remote processing computer back in Florida, so the point cloud registration tasks can run while I sleep and travel back home tomorrow. But since most hotels have questionable Wi-Fi speeds at best, that doesn't always work. I started the upload to our cloud hosting software at about 9 p.m. on Monday evening, then called it a night. I got up at the crack of dawn Tuesday morning, and the first thing I did was jump on my laptop to hopefully see the scan data had completed its upload, which meant I could get a jump start on the point cloud registration. Unfortunately, the upload only made it to about 40% completeness in 8 hours, so that threw a monkey wrench in that plan. I had no choice but to cancel the upload, pack up all of our gear as we had to check out, and head back to the site for some final QC measurements before driving back to New York to catch our afternoon flight home to Orlando. There are 3 levels of quality control I run on my survey and scanning projects. The first, I already explained how I QC the survey control network with the error propagation values and the residuals from StarNet, along with breaking up the closure and common point check shots and observing their delta coordinates. Now that we have a good starting point where the survey control should be better than half of our allowable error budget, The second level of QC is done by comparing the registered point cloud to the QC black and white targets we measured on site with the total station. This is giving me an idea of how well the point cloud fits the control network it was just registered to. If I'm not doing a rigid registration of the point cloud data, meaning that I'm not holding the cloud-to-cloud registration as fixed, I know the point cloud will distort and transform to fit the control points used fairly well. So I don't want to use those as checks. I want to have a set of check shots that are spaced out from those held control points to verify how the rest of the point cloud is looking. And my third level of QC checks the line work, model, or whatever deliverable we extract from the point cloud and compare that to the physical object it represents. To accomplish this in this situation, I made a number of measurements using a Leica disto accurate to 1 millimeter over 10 meters on different parts of the building and compare those measurements of walls, windowsills, and door openings to the dimensions of those features that were created for the deliverable. I then calculate the root mean squared error on the residuals, and that value is arguably the most important piece of information to the client on the accuracy report. It's telling them how well the data they are receiving fits the objects it represents. The first two levels of QC are more so for my knowledge. If my survey control QC comes back with issues, I know I need to fix the survey control before registering the point cloud to it. And if the point cloud QC comes back with issues, I know I need to fix the point cloud registration before trying to extract data from it. Since we ran out of daylight yesterday, we're now heading back to the site to take these distant measurements this morning. This disto has a handy feature where it will continually take a distance measurement and return the shortest value. This is great because I can tilt the disto up, down, left, or right until I'm sure I'm getting the shortest value of the wall, which theoretically means I'm measuring a perpendicular distance, which is what we will annotate on the model when doing our QC checks later. I took over 15 measurements distributed throughout the project on wall lengths, window frames, and other well-defined features, and sketched those into my iPad on top of the proposed siding plans provided. After about 30 minutes or so on site, we hopped back into our rental car, headed to Queens to drop it off, catch the shuttle to the airport, and make our flight back home. Episode 3 is a wrap and we have one more to go. We've collected all the data we need to produce a deliverable we were hired to do, and we're leaving site fairly confident that we are in good shape as far as data completeness goes. I wish I could have at least imported the raw scan data into RiScan and done a rough registration to verify our scan data is complete to an acceptable level, but due to the size of data and the short turnaround times, sometimes this just isn't always possible. As of right now, I would say I'm about 98% confident that we should have sufficient data, so I'm not too worried about it. In the next video, we'll look at how to register the scan data to create a compiled point cloud out of the over 300 individual scans, how to do quality control on that point cloud to make sure the registration process went well, how to extract usable information from the point cloud efficiently, and finally, how to QC the deliverable before sending it out. We have 3 business days left until delivery and a ton of work to do still. Point clouds are fun to look at, but they're rarely the last step in terms of what the end user needs in terms of data. If I spend 15 minutes on LinkedIn, I'm inundated with posts of point cloud animations and how this new scanner will revolutionize the industry. If you ask me, the next revolution in the industry isn't going to be made on the hardware side of things, it's going to come from innovative software. We can capture scan data pretty quickly these days, and registration has become fairly streamlined as well. But data extraction can be painfully slow and tedious still. It's not unheard of for companies to spend 5 to 10 times the amount of time for data extraction from a point cloud compared to data capture. An investment in knowledge on this front in terms of finding efficiencies will, in my opinion, pay the largest dividends compared to trying to save another 5 or 10 seconds per scan setup. It's just not as fun or exciting to talk about, so it doesn't get as much attention. That being said, going forward, I will be spending a bit more time making videos trying to focus on this, as I truly believe if we can cut down on data extraction time, we can start to see more and more industry acceptance. Thank you all for watching, and as always, subscribe if you want, like if you feel it's warranted, and I'll see you next time.